Welcome to 5 Good Questions. I'm your host, Jake Taylor. Our guest today is James Clear. James is an author, entrepreneur, and photographer. He writes about habits and human potential on his website, jamesclear.com. His focus is self-improvement that is supported by scientific research. James's work ends up being one part storytelling, one part academic research, and one part personal experimentation. I've been a subscriber to his weekly newsletter for years. Today we're going to be discussing his runaway bestseller, Atomic Habits. Let's ask James 5 good questions. But first, I'm happy to announce my literary debut, The Rebel Allocator, is now available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. You could say it's about time. I've been pouring my heart into this book for more than 3 years. A well-known SoCal billionaire received an early copy of the book and actually called me to say he enjoyed the story and was adamant that I get it made into a movie. Talk about a surreal experience getting 20 minutes on the phone with one of my heroes. My friend Tobias Carlisle had this to say: Jacob Taylor has written a modern-day investment classic. The Rebel Allocator is reminiscences of a stock operator for value investors. It's a fictionalized retelling of the lessons in The Intelligent Investor in an accessible page-turner. If you want to learn how to invest like Warren Buffett by sitting at his knee, this is the book for you. Wow, how flattering is that? I was blown away when he sent me that. I've created dozens of ad-free author interviews over the last 5 years and never asked for anything in return. If you've gotten any value out of these efforts, please do me a personal favor and pick up a copy of The Rebel Allocator. I promise you won't regret it. And now, on with the show. All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. My guest today is James Clear, author of Atomic Habits. James, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Hey, you bet. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
So I've been looking forward to this one for quite a while, mostly because we know each other reasonably well, and we actually met quite a while ago, a number of years ago at a conference, and a mutual friend of ours introduced us, and he told me after, I don't think I've ever told you this before, but he told me after, man, keep your eye on that guy. He's going to be big someday. And I told him, I was like, yeah, I could see that. And turns out he was underselling the case. So congrats on all of your success.
Oh, thanks, man. Wow, that's so nice. That's a fun story to hear.
Yeah. So your book, Atomic Habits, is doing quite well. New York Times bestseller list, top of Amazon. But I think maybe what's most important is that something we were talking a little bit before we started was that this is actually helping people, and that your work is actually making a difference. And so I don't know if do you want to share just a little bit of that before we get into the questions about why that's making a big deal for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, like everyone, I want my work to matter. I want my work to be useful and make a difference. And so it's great for me to hear. The one thing that's interesting about writing, especially writing online, is that you share these ideas. So if I publish an article on my site or I put a book out, but it's kind of a one-to-many communication, and it's sort of one-directional. Like I'm putting it out, but I often don't hear back from the people who are reading. And so it's just really nice, a big event like a book launch or something is a chance for you to hear from a lot of those people, whether it's speaking at an event or people emailing you about the launch or, I just finished the book and here's what I thought. And so it just feels good to hear about the ideas landing with folks. And a lot of the time it's something simple, like people using it in their daily life for workout habits or things like that. But then other times it's bigger stuff. It's like a company uses an idea from a chapter as their slogan for the next quarter. Or I heard from a doctor who printed out some of the articles and put them on the waiting room wall for his patients to read. Or there was an investment firm that recently brought me in to speak, and they found out about my stuff because a couple of the CFOs in this group that they're part of printed all the articles out and passed them around to all the other ones. And like, I don't get to hear about that stuff, right? Like I don't see it. So it's cool to learn about how your work is spreading. And it's stories like that, even though no individual one is super sexy. It just is neat to think like, these ideas are out there being used daily, like people are actually sitting in a meeting and talking about them or sharing with, some of their athletes, if they're a coach or a client, that they're working with or something like that. And so I think ultimately that's the most important thing because, why else would I write, and just writing to try to add my little bit to human knowledge and, and hopefully share something that people can apply in their daily lives. So it feels good.
Yeah. So specifically about the book, for question number one is, what makes being thoughtful about our habits so important?
So I think about the process of improvement as kind of being like circular. And so at first, what you need is some kind of awareness. So you use the phrase being thoughtful, but basically, like once you become aware of a problem or aware of a certain type of behavior that you perform, now you actually have the chance to design it. Like your behavior could change without you being aware of it. That happens all the time. Maybe someone will shift the way that, the cafeteria is laid out. And so people buy different foods because of that or something like that.
Yeah.
But even though your behavior is changing in those circumstances, you're not in control. So if you want to be in control of the process, you almost always have to be aware of your behavior first. So you become aware of it. Then the next stage of the circle or the cycle is you practice the change that you want to make. So it's some kind of like deliberate practice or a little bit effortful. You're concentrating. And then with increased fluency or with increased repetition, you develop fluency and skill. And eventually that thing that was effortful starts to become more automatic and habitual. But then once it's habitual, you kind of close the loop and we're back to, because you can do it on autopilot, you no longer pay attention. And so now you need to raise your thoughtfulness, raise your level of awareness again, become aware of where you're at currently, and then try to start the process again. So I often like to recommend that people use what I call the Habit Scorecard as a good starting point. And basically you just write down all of the behaviors that you do each day. So like I wake up, I turn off my alarm, I check Instagram, I make my bed, I go take a shower, I brush my teeth, I get dressed, whatever. And you go through your day with that level of granularity. And then if it's a positive habit, you just assign a little plus sign next to it. If it's negative, minus sign. And if it's fairly neutral, then you can put an equal sign. And the goal with that actually is not to like judge your behavior or to feel guilty or feel good or bad about it. The goal is simply to become aware of it. And once you have that list and you start to realize, oh, wow, this is something I do every day, or this is something that I didn't realize this was a habit, but it turns out like this is pretty consistent for me. Then you have a chance to actually improve it and kind of start that cycle that we talked about. So I think thoughtfulness and awareness and attention play a crucial role in kickstarting the process of behavior change.
So this is probably a pretty good segue, and maybe you've covered some of this already, but for question number 2, what are a few of the best practices for good habit hygiene? Maybe talk about some of the key things that you could do at different points of the cycle to maybe supercharge your cycle or something.
Yeah. So we already talked a little bit about awareness and kind of priming that to get started. Another crucial process for good habit hygiene, I would say, is the process of reflection and review. And this is an interesting one because it can happen at multiple time scales, right? So like you could have the shortest time scale is you have some kind of measurement or reflection that's happening automatically, right? So like my calendar automatically measures where I travel to each year. I don't even think about it. It's just because it's on the calendar. I could look back at the end of the year and it's there. Or Google Analytics automatically measures how many people are coming to my website. So sometimes it's really nice to have those kind of measurement tools so that you can look back on them and you don't have to worry about tracking each time. Mm-hmm. And then the next level up is actually like manual tracking. So it takes a little bit longer than automatic. But like I do this with my workout habit where every time I go to the gym, I write down each set I do and how many reps and what the weight was. And then at the end of the workout, it feels good to close the book on another training session, right? It's like a small thing, but that kind of tracking or reflection review is nice. And the next time I go in, I can pick the weights and sets that I do based on what I did last time. So it kind of helps calibrate how you should change the next time.
I found that when I do that thing too, I don't cheat as much on because if I write it down, then like I should have done all 10 of those reps, right?
I had a really tough training schedule over the summer, and I was not feeling motivated to get through the workouts. And so I started doing a little hack like that where I would finish a set and then I would immediately write down the next set on my journal. And I'd sit there for like 3 minutes and wouldn't feel like doing it. But then I would think, well, this one's already written down, so I'll just do this one. And then I'd do the same thing. And gradually I would coax myself through the workout.
Yeah.
So that's another level. Then the next level up is like weekly and monthly reviews. And this is where you start to notice some of the caveats for like these good habit hygiene and like what's necessary. I don't think it's necessary to track every habit at a weekly or monthly level. But for some habits, for the important ones, it can make sense. Like for my business, I track, revenue, expenses, net income, cash on hand, stuff like that on a weekly and monthly level because it's important. But then there's other stuff like how many countries visited, how many different countries did people read from this week or things like that, that I like, I'll look at that like once a year, but it's not essential. And then finally, at the longest time scale, you've got like an annual review. And I have found that that's very helpful for me for reviewing habits, that I can look back at the end of each year. I typically just track how many articles I wrote, how many workouts I did, how many new places I traveled to, things like that. And that data, it helps inform me, like, does something need to change next year? Like, did I say something was important to me, but then I actually just didn't show up on it? And so I think that those
you put that out in a public format too. I know with you do an inner review of yourself, basically, and you publish it. And I think I have to imagine that over the course of a year, that causes a lot of little changes that just because you're going to have to say it publicly come December. It's like, okay, I better stick to what I've been saying this whole time.
I had a moment like that in June where I was like, I was dealing with a situation. I was like, I really don't want to have to write about this in December. I guess I need to get this done. And like, I was putting off this conversation that I should have. And then I was like, all right, I'll just do it because I didn't want to, have to publish it. So there is a nice little accountability factor there as well. But anyway, the theme here is reflection and review is really helpful for habits like that.
Do you do a daily kind of journal at the end of the day?
Kind
of what went right, what went wrong?
I hadn't been doing that, but I just got, we made a habit journal. I partner with Baron Fig, who's a premium notebook manufacturer. And I got the first one right here. And I just got it this week. And one of the things that I love about it is at the beginning, it's mostly a dot grid journal. So you could use it for like anything you would use a dot grid notebook for. But at the very beginning, there's a section called 1 line per day where you journal for 1 sentence each day. And I've done that for the last week now, and I've loved it. It's been a great way to make journaling an easy habit. Yeah. And so anyway, I'm excited to share this with people. So it's a habit journal that we have launching in just a few weeks.
Awesome. So question number 3, and this is kind of steering things back towards investing a little bit. I kind of wanted to get your take. What would you guess would be some of the commonalities as far as habits go of good investors? And if maybe that's too hard, I don't want to let you off the hook completely, but maybe it'd be smart to use Charlie Munger's idea of inverting and maybe ask what some of the bad habits in investing might be.
Buy Bitcoin. It's a good question. I find that, I think we could broaden it even a little bit more than investors, but just talk about like high performers in general.
Okay.
And I think as a baseline, and this is going to be true for investing, but also many other areas, you've got what I would call habits of energy and habits of focus. So habits of energy are things like, the basic idea is we all have 24 hours in a day, but it doesn't matter if you have an hour to do something if you don't have the energy to do it. If you don't have the ability to act in that hour. So this is things like making sure you get 8 hours of sleep or get enough sleep each night, dialing in your exercise habits so that you can be sure that you're, working out enough. Like your body is the home that you live in every moment of your life. And so if you don't have your body in a good space, it's hard to bring your best energy to whatever investing decision you're trying to make.
Yeah. I
also think back on quotes like, I believe Richard Branson was asked, like, what would you do differently if you were going to build your business again? And he was like, work out more, which is like such a interesting answer, but like makes sense because it ripples into every other area. And then nutrition. So I would say sleep, exercise, and nutrition. Those are what I would call habits of energy. And then you've got habits of focus. And this is something that I struggle with. I think the interesting thing is so one of the things I'm going to recommend here is prioritizing what tasks you should work on each day. I think that's a good habit of focus, right? And people have heard things like that before, right? Like, oh, write down your most important tasks and work on the most crucial thing first. But everybody already knows that is very different than everybody already does that.
Right.
And I find that there are many times when there have been days where I rank and prioritize what I should work on, and I work on the most important thing first. And things go really well on those days. But it doesn't happen. I bet it doesn't even happen 25% of the time for me. And that's interesting because it works, but you still aren't doing it as much.
Yeah.
And so I think investing in particular is such an interesting field because it's such a psychological thing.
Yeah.
It's like it's so psychological. It's just getting yourself to not make mistakes, getting yourself to not fall in to these pitfalls that tend to suck everybody into, and working on the least important thing is a good example of that. It's like, well, I know that's important, but for whatever reason, my psychology is saying this is urgent today. I should work on this instead. Or I wonder what's happening on social media. Or did someone send me an email? Or should I check ESPN and look at the latest sports news? And like none of that stuff is the important thing, and it's not, but you still find yourself being pulled in. And so I think habits of focus are also crucial. And I think in a weird way, people talk about this with investment choices as well, like making wise investment choices and focusing on the fundamentals. I think we could say something similar about habits. Focusing on the fundamentals of good energy and good focus habits is going to make a big difference in the long run.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to imagine if someone who has spent as much time thinking about habits and and being really thoughtful about constructing kind of their day-to-day time as yourself, and you score yourself at under 25%, I mean, I feel like the rest of us are probably have some room for improvement there.
Yeah, probably. So the last one that I'll add to this, which I feel like is kind of a meta habit, is reading. I think you would be hard pressed to find a good investor who did not read a lot. And it's simple because like you need to find your margin somewhere. And it's hard to just pluck that out of thin air. Like you need to have a very broad set of ideas to pull from to find some kind of leverage. And I think the phrase that keeps coming back to me that I think is highly relevant, not only to investing, but to many areas of life, is broad funnel, tight filter. How can we...
Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So broad funnel is like... let's explore widely, take in as many options as we can, build a huge data set, and then tight filter is let's take that massive data set and let's pare it down to only the very best options. And one way to build a broad funnel is to read widely, to read things that are disparate, and sometimes it's obvious how they're related, but other times it's not. But you can use that very broad network or lattice of knowledge to explore different areas. And I also think this is a little less about habits and just a little more about investing in general. But often the most valuable data sets do not exist. They have to be created. And that's part of this broad funnel, tight filter philosophy. Like I'm thinking specifically, so I just wrote this book, right? We just launched Atomic Habits. And I would love to know a few things. Like, for example, we would like to get the book featured in airport stores. And I would love to know how much does it cost to be featured in those stores? And how many copies will you sell at each location? And can you select which locations? Like, could I say, I just want to be in Boston and LA and Cleveland? And would those, are those areas moving more copies than others? And that data is not readily available. Presumably there's someone that has that in like different pieces, but I don't know if anybody has it all in one place. And because there's not even really just one company that's in charge of all that. And so we're building that ourselves, right? We have to come up with that data set. And once we have that, then we have this broad funnel of information that most people don't have. And then we can just apply a tight filter to it and try to see the highest performing locations and focus there. And I think that you can do that with stock choices, with different companies you're looking at investing in, with pretty much anything. say you're starting a restaurant and you want to have the world's like best menu. Well, like let's go to LA and let's go to 50 restaurants and let's see what the best dish is at each restaurant. And then let's do it in New York and San Francisco and Chicago. And you spend a year creating this huge data set of the absolute best dishes at the best places. And then tight filter, right? Like we're only going to pick 10 for our menu. And that's how we end up coming up with the world's best menu. And most people don't want to build that data set because that it's just hard and it takes time. Yeah. But if you have it, it becomes very valuable.
Yeah. So question number 4, and this is kind of the one I'm most intrigued to hear your answer about. Is there any dark side to habits? And what I'm thinking about here is it possible that you get so much structure in your life that maybe you can kind of sap away some of the spontaneity, the joie de vivre, the really that being present that I think a lot of people are aiming for these days?
So I think there is a downside to building better habits, but it's not the one that you just mentioned. So my first response to, do habits make my life too structured? What about, will I be robotic? I don't want to pigeonhole myself into one type of lifestyle. Yeah. What about being spontaneous and creative and free flowing? And I think most of the time with that, they're kind of like cutting habits off at the source before they even they never even get close to that being a problem, but they use that as an excuse for it being an issue. And what you actually find, if you get your habits dialed in, is that habits do not restrict freedom, they create it. Like, it's often the people who have the worst habits that have the least amount of freedom and creativity and spontaneity. Like people who have bad financial habits are always wondering, like, where's the next dollar going to come from? Right. Or people who have terrible nutrition habits always feel like they don't have enough energy. Or people who have bad learning and reading habits are always feeling like they're behind the curve. And so it's the people who have that stuff dialed in that actually have the resources and the space available to do the fun, spontaneous, creative thing. Now, that said, I do think there is a downside to building habits. And broadly speaking, it's that as a habit becomes built, there are two things that start working against you. So the first is that with increased repetition, you can begin to do something good enough on autopilot. And so you stop thinking about how to do it better. And there was one study that I found particularly interesting. It was on surgeons. And they found that throughout residency and into the first years of being a surgeon, their skills increased each year. But then it hits a peak after doing it for a few years. And it starts to become repetitive. It starts to become boring. You can do it on autopilot. And so there's a slight decline in performance after that point. And basically, once you can do it good enough, you start to overlook your mistakes is the key point. So that's the first issue. Then the second issue is that the more that you do something and the more habitual either a thought or behavior becomes, the more you begin to tie your identity to that thing. And so the downside of adopting an identity is that it becomes difficult to grow beyond it. The tighter that you cling to it, the harder it is to try something new, to upgrade and expand, to continuously improve. And so this is why you see things like a band has one hit album and then they get locked into only playing a certain type of music, or a manager has his way of doing things and they won't update and improve the processes, or there's a teacher who her lesson plans have stayed the same for 20 years and she's not going to upgrade even though there's different technology in the classroom now. And basically you get tied to that habit, that way of doing things, and it becomes hard to continuously improve. So those two things I think are actual downsides of habits. And this is why we need to return to some of the things you mentioned early in this conversation, being aware, kickstarting that process of reflection and review, and trying to find those gaps in your thinking so that you can continue the process of improvement in the long run.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So question number 5, a little bit more personal question, but what's the one bad habit that's been the hardest for you to personally break? If you have broken it or not yet.
I have not, and I'm still struggling with it now. I've been working on it the last few months, and I am getting a little better at it, but it's still not dialed in. So I guess for lack of a better word, I would say it's my power down habit. So I sleep just fine, but there's often nights where it's 9 or 10 p.m. and I'll find myself getting a second wind, and I'm like, well, I could just answer email for like, let me just do like 20 minutes or something. And then I turn around and it's like midnight or 1.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't want to cheat myself on sleep, but I know that I perform better when I get up early. So I'd rather be up at like 7 or 8, but now I'm going to bed at 1. So I'm not going to get up till, 9 or something like that. And that, for whatever reason, that has been challenging for me to cut that off. And it often has to do with screen time. It has to do like I'm almost never staying up late if I'm not looking at a screen. And so some of the things I'm trying now, my favorite solution is a friend of mine bought what's called an outlet timer. And so it's basically like a surge protector kind of, or like something you plug into an outlet.
Yeah.
But you plug your device into it, and you can set it to kill the power at a particular time. So what he did was he plugged his internet router in,
yeah,
and then he set it to kill the power at 10 p.m. each night.
So the Wi-Fi goes off at 10, and then
exactly, Wi-Fi's off, can't watch Netflix, can't answer email, time to go to bed, and that's one that that I like solutions like that kind of force your hand, but I need a couple different things like that are helping keep me in line. But that's one that I've struggled with.
Yeah, no, that's I think everyone or a lot of people have that same problem. It feels like it's hard to go to bed. One thing I have tried that has helped for me personally has been we use some of those like blue light blocking glasses. And when I put those on, I don't even know now if it's like the placebo effect of putting them on is even enough to where I'm like, all right, I'm starting to get kind of tired. Yeah. Like it's all right. It's time to just slowly wind it down.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that's a good, there is some kind of like internal cue there where you're like, I only put these glasses on before I get ready to go to sleep. Right. So it's like kind of reminding you a little bit.
Yeah.
I've used the technology solutions, like where, it makes the screen yellow,
right.
Or, some of those. So that's helpful. Cuts out the blue light. But your solution is even more, it's even more habitual, right? The act of putting on the glasses is like the initiation of your power down routine.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like a habit that I think can be stacked from at that point.
Yeah, right. That's good.
So bonus question we always ask, and that is for a book recommendation. And given that it's coming from someone who I know really values reading a lot, and I know plows through a fair amount of books every year, I'm excited to hear what you have. And typically what we're looking for is either something that you think is totally under the radar and underrated, or maybe the book that you've given the most to other people. Yeah.
Okay. Can I give you both? All right. Sure. So the book that I've gifted the most is called Manual for Living by Epictetus. And so it's, the most popular of the Stoic philosopher books is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is great. But I think that Manual for Living is an easier read. And I think it's just as timeless. And you can do it in an hour. It's kind of like listening to the Tao Te Ching. It's like if you got an hour and you don't know what to do, like just read that and like it'll be an hour well spent. So that one's really good. And then the second one is called Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant, which I feel like is very underrated. So, husband-wife combo, they spent 60 years as historians writing this huge compendium of everything that's happened in history. It was like 12 encyclopedic volumes. And then when they finished writing these thousands of pages and millions of words, they wrote a little book called The Lessons of History that's like 100 pages or less about the recurring themes throughout history. And as someone who's really interested in like human behavior and habits, I feel like it was a particularly good read to hear about like these are the things that recur. These are some of the things you can bank on. And with regards to investing, a lot of the time the conversation is not about like what will change because it's so hard to predict that. It's about like what won't change.
Yeah.
What's going to stay the same? What can you rely on? What can you place a bet around? And I think that book clarifies a little bit of that, although of course the task is still very hard. Yeah, I really enjoyed that one as well. As far as like sort of showing you the different pendulums of history that just swing back and forth throughout time. And you kind of get a sense of where you are maybe in history on the different continuums. I like that way of thinking about it because I've started to think that a little bit more recently. History is a very broad, long swinging pendulum, and you live only in a certain part of that arc. right? And so it's like, some parts of that arc will serve you and some parts of that arc will hinder you, and you don't get any control over it. But I think it helps you see the world for what it is a little bit more, and maybe not get as frustrated. There can still be plenty of frustrating moments and circumstances, things that are outside your control. But it helps you step back and see a little broader sense of perspective. So anyway, those two are good. And then I'll give you one final third one that I don't think a lot of people have read. It's a book written by a neuroscientist and psychologist. Her name's Lisa Feldman Barrett, and it's called How Emotions Are Made. And it was a very instructive book for me as I was reading and writing Atomic Habits, because it talks about how emotions and, in many cases, behavior are predictive, not reactive. We often think we're going through life reacting to things that are happening to us. Somebody says something and you feel a certain way, or something happens and you run the other way or something like that. But in many cases, actually, behavior is predictive. You see, the way that I would describe it, and the phrase that I like to use when talking about it relating to habits, is that perceived value motivates you to act. Actual value motivates you to repeat. And so what I mean by that is you walk into a kitchen and you see a plate of cookies and you think, oh, I have this habit of every time I see cookies, I eat them. But actually, it's the prediction, it's the anticipation that drives the response. It's not the cookie that gets you to eat it. It can't be, because you haven't had it yet. It's the image that it creates in your mind. You see the cookie and then you predict, this will be tasty, this will be sugary, this will be enjoyable. And that's the motivational force that gets you to take action. And this is true for almost anything in life, that the behaviors you take are driven by the predictions that precede them. And so her book illuminates more of the neuroscience behind that, and I think helps shed some light on some nuanced look at how emotions drive behavior. And for many investors who, of course, are very curious about the emotions that drive the market cycle and so on, I think it might be an interesting read.
Yeah, that is interesting. I know a little bit about some of the reflexivity that happens there, where the idea that something is going to happen actually kind of is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy happens at that point. Like, I don't know, if you prime someone to be nervous about taking a math test, and then they end up doing poorly on the math test because they got all in their head about it. Same type of the reality of it is not always necessarily not as cut and dry as we like to think it is.
Yeah, there are all kinds of studies like that. Like if you bring a set of girls in, you tell them girls are bad at math, they do worse on the test than they would if you didn't tell them that. So there are examples of, and conversely the same thing. Like if you bring people in, you tell them you're good at math, and they improve. It's an example of the beliefs, emotions, and predictions that come before the action shaping the response. And that's in my model that I have in the book. That's one reason why I feel like having that second stage of craving before the action is incredibly important for understanding why we act the way we do. But anyway, yeah, that book provides a little bit more insight on all that.
Well, James, thanks for coming on the show today. And I had a great time and really appreciate you taking the time out for it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Before you go, do me the huge honor of picking up your copy of The Rebel Allocator, available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. It's a business person's guide to effective capital allocation, told in a coming-of-age story of a college grad who crosses paths with a wealthy Midwesterner. It's fiction for the nonfiction reader. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you'd like to support this author and purchase their book, click here. If you'd like to become a subscriber to 5GQ, click here. And I included a couple other interviews that you might appreciate right here. Thanks, happy reading.